Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant. Let's talk about the fight. What can I say?
I mean, I'm not surprised.
The fight went on a little longer than I thought it would. That much I will admit, though the fight's aesthetic and its outcome. It's everything that I expected. I expected Caleb Plant's minimalist approach to boxing.
I expected him to fiddle throughout the fight.
I expected him to try and finagle and fiddle his way to a points decision because I didn't see Caleb trying to take it to Canelo Alvarez, and he didn't.
I mean, he was never going to impose his will.
Trying to assert his dominance. No. I expected that Caleb would try and finesse fight his way to a points decision against a very aggressive Canelo Alvarez that in all likelihood would be front foot heavy, backing him into those ropes.
Because Caleb won't hold the center of the ring.
The most I could give Caleb in terms of rounds in the bank, approximately 3, maybe 4 rounds, none of which were all that clear. While some of the fight fans on boxing Twitter did their best to try and lie to themselves about what they were looking at, convince themselves that Caleb Plant and his minimalist approach was
7 rounds to 2.
Is he serious?
Well, there were plenty of guys like this on Twitter.
Plenty of guys with their little anecdotal scorecards trying to hoodwink and gaslight the rest of the boxing community into thinking that Caleb was somehow winning that fight when, in reality, not a single one, not one
of the judges had Caleb up.
Caleb was the house fighter. All 3 of the judges had the fight in favor of Canelo Alvarez at the time that Canelo stopped Caleb Plant in the 11th. The people at CBS Sports, they had Canelo Alvarez up by a wide margin, I might add.
I only had Caleb winning 3, maybe 4 rounds.
Maybe. And it wasn't clear, it wasn't concise, it wasn't decisive.
But the most I could give him was 3 or 4 rounds.
3 or 4 out of the 11. Though if you're feeling generous and you want to go ahead and give Caleb at least 4 rounds of the 11,
that's 7 for Alvarez.
7 rounds to 4 in favor of Canelo Alvarez. And the most I could give Caleb was 3, maybe 4 rounds.
And no more.
Undisputed super lightweight champion Josh Taylor addressed these anomalous anecdotal scorecards on Twitter and said, I don't know what people were watching back home going by some of the tweets, but at ringside, that was a methodical beatdown from Canelo. I gave Plant 2-3 rounds tops. He was being pushed around the ring far too easily. And Josh Taylor's comments speak to something we often talk about here on the channel, that, your back, it doesn't find itself on those ropes by itself. It doesn't happen by accident. If your back's on the ropes, you're being put there by the other guy.
Last I checked, that's where you don't want to be.
Whereas the only time you saw Canelo Alvarez with his back on those ropes was when he was there deliberately attempting to bait Caleb Plant to come inside and do the business. Come inside, let some shots go. Caleb didn't take the bait. He didn't want to do it. Better still, Caleb
spent far more time with his back on those ropes than Canelo did.
Australia's own blonde bomber, Ebony Bridges, took to social media and stated, does my head in. People don't respect high guard, parry, and short, sharp head movement from a pressure fighter, #casuals. That is classic Mexican-style boxing and defense. If they don't land clean, they don't count. Simple. Throw as much as you want. This ain't the Emmys, and that speaks to the occasional counter shots from Caleb, the occasional flurries that landed on Canelo Alvarez's guard. Maybe a shot gets through at the tail end, a single shot, but most of what Caleb was doing...
I told you, he's trying to fiddle his way through the fight.
Caleb Plant was, ultimately, ineffective. That's how Ishai Smith described the situation. He said there's a difference between effective boxing and ineffective boxing. Stop giving that man props because he was surviving. Deontay Wilder went out on his fucking shield. You don't talk that big shit and don't back it up. And what makes Caleb's boxing, as it were, his approach, ineffective, is for all his movement and all his feinting and flickering of the jab and his minimalist approach to trying to win a round, for all of that, he was still getting backed into those ropes. Nothing, and I mean nothing that he did stopped Canelo Alvarez from getting on that front foot, stalking him, walking him down, and pinning him in the corner or on those ropes. Nothing Caleb Plant did discouraged Canelo Alvarez. He kept coming after him. I mean, what exactly are these people trying to convince me of? That Caleb Plant's winning the fight by not being able to hold the center of the ring?
Get the fuck out of here.
Who's spending more time with their back on those ropes?
Caleb.
And while he's giving up all this ground, all this real estate, is Caleb Plant at least matching Canelo Alvarez's output?
No.
Is he landing more punches than Canelo Alvarez?
No.
Then how is it competitive? What was competitive about the fight? What was competitive about the rounds? This ain't a game of freeze tag. This is boxing. My honest opinion, my honest take on Caleb Plant's approach, an approach that I've seen many times in the past, is that he's only fighting half of a fight. I understand hit and not get hit, but you're focusing on the not get hit part more than the hit part. You've still got to take it to the other guy.
You have to find a way.
And if the overall aesthetic of the match is something akin to a gazelle running from a lion, you're losing.
It's not competitive.
It just isn't. We're not all gathered here under the auspices of the Nevada State Athletic Commission to watch you play freeze tag and try and survive against the other guy. We're here to see a fight. And if you won't engage, if your only way of biding your time in this fight,
An occasional counter.
occasional flurry between lulls as your back is being put on those ropes by the other guy who you can't seem to discourage, you can't seem to back off. Use your brain. Use your fucking brain. If you're giving up more real estate than the other guy, and the guy's not only throwing more than you are, he's landing more than you are, in what way is that competitive? In what way was Caleb Plant winning this fight? He wasn't. We all know he wasn't, because he is.
He's what I thought he was.
He's a solid fighter, solid champion, but he's out of his depth because he hasn't been under the hot lights as many times in as many high-level situations as Canelo Alvarez. So this worked out exactly like I thought it would work out.
Canelo, knockout.
I mean, ain't that what I've been telling you guys all this time? Post-fight, after Canelo Alvarez effectively became this division's undisputed champion, the latest undisputed champion in the four-belt era behind Josh Taylor, Michael said super middleweight may not have been the strongest division in boxing, but it still had 3 solid undefeated world champions before Canelo Alvarez crashed the party. In the space of 11 months, he's fought them all, beaten them all, and taken all of their belts. Undisputed. And that first part, about how the super middleweight division may not have been the strongest division. It's interesting because I wonder if it were Billy Joe Saunders, or Callum Smith, or Caleb Plant, or David Benavidez that did what Canelo Alvarez did in the span of only 11 months. If it were them that did what Canelo did, would we be hearing this?
Would anybody be sat around saying that it's not the strongest division?
If it were Jamal Charlo that moved up in weight, the way that Canelo Alvarez moved up in weight, if it were him that fought Billy Joe Saunders, that fought Callum Smith, that fought Caleb Plant, would we be hearing this?
Would we be seeing it?
It's a bit of a backhanded compliment, if you ask me, and it's not the first time I've seen it. I've seen it before. I saw it the night that Terence Crawford became an undisputed champion at 140 pounds, a division that...
Oh, maybe it's not one of the glamour weights.
That wasn't the only instance I've seen it in the past. No, I saw it shortly after Alexander Usyk became the cruiserweight division's undisputed champion.
Casuals in the West.
Here in the West, Americans didn't want to acknowledge Alexander Usyk's monumental run towards becoming the cruiserweight division's undisputed champion, all on the road, all in hostile territory. Thus, I'm not the least bit surprised.
I'm not surprised to see this again.
I'm not, because the super lightweight division, the super middleweight division, the cruiserweight division, these are not the, according to Hoyle, characteristic glamour weights that are often glamorized. But when you think about those glamour weights, the lightweight division, the welterweight division, the middleweight division, what's happening at those weights right now?
Well, not a lot.
No more and no less, though in some instances it is less than what we got from the super middleweight division last night. It is but a mere perception that these glamour weights are so talent-rich that they are somehow better
than super middleweight.
You think about a quote-unquote talent-rich division like the lightweight division, where Ryan Gersha is off somewhere being a peacock, being a prima donna. Gervonta Davis won't fight any of his contemporaries, not a Lopez,
Nope.
not a Haney.
Nope.
You think about this. You think about these glamour weights. You think about the welterweight division, a division where we were waiting for years for Crawford versus Spence. We still haven't got it. We haven't gotten so much as Crawford versus Thurman.
We are getting Crawford versus Porter.
And I like that fight. I do. I'm going to purchase that pay-per-view the way I purchased last night's pay-per-view, though we all know in our heart of hearts what was the mega fight was Spence versus Thurman, which quickly became Spence versus Crawford. We didn't get either of those fights. For a long time, people were hounding Keith Thurman with the name of Errol Spence Jr., and people quickly realized Keith had no intention of having that fight, not when he had something to lose.
And Errol Spence adopted that same mentality.
He did when it came to Terence Crawford. You think about the heavyweight division, the granddaddy of all weight classes, and how offer after offer after offer was made to Deontay Wilder for the big Undisputed title fight. You had two guys, unbeaten guys, in their prime, both world champions. Wilder turns the offer down. I guess $100 million wasn't enough. Losing to Tyson Fury for $30 million, that was better.
Then losing to him again for less than that.
These are the glamour weights. That's the glamour weights for you, these stacked, talent-rich divisions that seem to be stacked with guys that don't really want it as bad as Canelo Alvarez wanted it. And he wanted it in the super middleweight division, which he unified in only 11 months. And if he did it in that amount of time, it's not because it was easy.
No, it wasn't easy.
Perhaps it seems easy because of the kind of fighter that Canelo Alvarez is, the kind of caliber fighter that he is. Perhaps it seems easy, but if it were easy, those guys would have done it before he got there.
If it were so easy that anybody could do it.
If it were so easy that we're going to look at this era's super middleweights and say to ourselves that it wasn't the strongest division, if that's what we're going to tell ourselves...
Then why didn't Charlo move up and do it?
Why didn't Gennady Golovkin? It's not the strongest division, right?
Right.
A conversation in that kind of an arena in reference to this division accents...
You say it's not the strongest division, what are you trying to say?
The truth is that a guy like Charlo, if he were willing to cross over into the necessary political boundary lines that often prevent fights from happening, if he threw caution to the wind, the way that Canelo Alvarez threw caution to the wind, parting ways from Golden Boy, but staying on his own long enough to pick up 2 world titles before he goes.
It was 3.
And subsequently crossing over to the PBC side of things, if the guys at middleweight were willing to do what they had to do, the way that Canelo was willing to do what he had to do, we'd see a lot more of that at these glamour weights. But you know why they're not willing to do it? Because it's not easy.
Jamal don't want to go to the zone for Demetrius Andrade.
And he's pretending that he wants a Gennady Golovkin fight. But Gennady Golovkin is under contract with the zone, so if you want him, you'd still have to go over there to get him. And if that's the case, do you think he'd cross over?
No.
When you talk about this era's super middleweight division, you're talking about a division that not that long ago had 3, 4 unbeaten guys in their prime, all of them world champions. We're going to describe this as being weaker than some other weight class from, it looks to me, super middleweight is in no better and no worse condition than the middleweight division was, than the middleweight division has been, with the difference being that there was one guy there that was determined to get the job done, so that when he actually gets the job done, post-fight, we can hear about how that division wasn't strong or it wasn't the strongest division. Am I hearing this right? Why don't we just give the credit where it's due? To who it's due to? It's due to Canelo Alvarez, because he did what a lot of guys don't want to do in a lot of other weight classes.
You know, the ones that are supposed to be better than this one.
Right. So, all those guys who spent all that time blowing smoke up people's asses about what Caleb Plant was going to do to Canelo Alvarez have quickly...
Oh, they've already started changing their tune.
The ones that aren't defending their shitty little off-base scorecards, they've gone from having a high opinion of Caleb Plant and viewing him as a worthy adversary that would defeat Canelo Alvarez
To not having a high opinion of him.
because he's a white man.
Well, that didn't bother you in the build-up of the fight.
In spite of that, guys like this gentleman here, Fartman, he picked Caleb Plant to beat Canelo Alvarez.
That worked out about as well as his prediction on Wilder versus Fury 3.
Well, he's not the only dumb dullard out there that doesn't want to give Canelo Alvarez his flowers, already volunteering other boogeymen that Canelo Alvarez is supposed to be avoiding. An account that goes by the name of Chololo_Cowboys says that version of Canelo Alvarez tonight gets stopped by Charlo, by Benavidez, and by Andrade, Demetrius Andrade.
Oh, really?
He gets stopped by the same Jamal Charlo who could not stop a junior middleweight and Brandon Adams at middleweight. Did you guys forget about that fight? Brandon Adams had no real body of work in the middleweight division where Jamal Charlo fought him. And in the middleweight division, Jamal couldn't stop him. He decisioned that guy, that very unheralded guy, just as unheralded as Juan Macias Montiel, who he fought in his last fight. He didn't stop that guy either, but he's supposed to stop Canelo Alvarez.
What kind of fucking drugs are these guys on?
You talk about Demetrius Andrade, a very crafty, herky-jerky southpaw with an awkward style that perhaps could give Canelo Alvarez problems, though ultimately, I don't see Demetrius stopping Canelo, because Demetrius couldn't stop Liam Williams, and Liam Williams, in his last fight, well, he's no Canelo Alvarez.
That's not a knock on Demetrius. I like Demetrius.
But if he were to, by some chance, pull off a miracle win over Canelo Alvarez, it would have to be on points, and we all know how difficult it is to beat Canelo Alvarez on points. Demetrius isn't known for his stopping power as a middleweight, or even a junior middleweight, but you think he's going to go up there to super middleweight to stop Canelo?
Yeah, right.
Now, the only one of these guys that I think actually has stopping power is David Benavidez. At what level is the question, because David Benavidez, in spite of having been a young champion, a very young champion, he hasn't faced the best and brightest fighters in this division either. He just hasn't. I mean, there's very little to draw from fights like the Porky Medina fight, where he knocked that guy out, gave him a nice little shoe shine. Good stuff for the highlight reel. Ronald Ellis.
Romer Angulo.
He's supposed to be fighting Tyrone Davis in his very next fight. I believe that's next week. I think the best name on David Benavidez's resume is the name of Anthony Durrell, though that's really not saying much. I mean, I do think that David Benavidez has stopping power, though for Canelo, that wouldn't be the first time he faced a big puncher. A big guy with stopping power. He fought Gennady Golovkin, the biggest puncher in the middleweight division at that time. He fought Callum Smith, big puncher himself. Big guy.
Fought Sergey Kovalev, too.
Perhaps not the best version of him, though still a big guy, an effective guy. Effective enough that he beat Eleider Alvarez in their rematch and won his belt back. Subsequently went on to have a WBO title defense against unbeaten Anthony Yard. He knocked him out, too. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that Canelo Alvarez fought a statuesque fighter that can punch. And in those fights, Canelo Alvarez won.
In spite of the power.
In spite of the other guy's size. Per a tweet from Mike Coppinger via his sources, Canelo says that he plans to sit down with Eddie Reynoso in January to plot out his next fight, and that he had a great experience with the PBC and Showtime. And I think Canelo Alvarez is going to have an extended stay on PBC's Isolation Island for at least one more fight, at least one more. And I think that fight is going to be the Jermall Charlo fight, a fight that I think could do very well at the gate in the state of Texas.
At Jared's house.
Where Spence and Mikey Gersha had their fight. I think that's a fight that could do very good business, could do very good at the gate in the state of Texas. I even think it could do decent numbers on pay-per-view, though we've no idea what this fight did on pay-per-view. It'll be some time before we get those numbers, and we'll see. Ultimately, I think it's going to be Jermall Charlo that Canelo Alvarez ends up fighting next.
But hey, we'll find out in January.